Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for spending some of your lunch hour with us today. What I'm going to spend some time on is discussing some recent security research that we published. And this is research that was based on analysis of 455 days worth of security event data from our 4,186 customers. You can see that the research is based on over 250,000 verified security incidents that our Security Operations Center staff were able to confirm from over 7 million events and more than 1 billion security anomalies that were analyzed over this particular time period. And there are 5 key findings from this research that I'm going to focus this short talk on. The first is that what we're seeing is that the initial phases of the cyber kill chain are being compressed, and that makes your response to security events need to adapt to change to the attacker's behavior. The second is that it used to be that certain industries and certain sizes of companies had a less of a risk of being attacked and potentially getting breached. And we're seeing that that is going away, and I'll show you some data around that. The third is we're seeing an increase in the use of automation. The fourth, we'll talk a little bit about crypto mining and crypto jacking and how we're seeing that is really on the rise. And then fifth, an oldie but a goodie, a persistent attack is on your web applications, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So first, let's talk about the cyber kill chain. For those of you that aren't familiar with the cyber kill chain, it was something that was developed by Lockheed Martin. You can go and Google and learn more about it. This is a summary level view of the traditional steps in the cyber kill chain that attackers follow. And it used to be with attackers following this kind of an approach where they initially do reconnaissance, then they look to weaponize their attack, they deliver that particular attack, and then exploit a known vulnerability and install malware on the host device, and then are able to then gain control over that particular device. It used to be that with this traditional kill chain, you could take preventative measures and response measures at each one of these steps. And what we're seeing now is that increasingly those first 5 steps of the cyber kill chain are being compressed through the use of automation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up in a moment. What that means is that the traditional approach of trying to detect someone who's doing reconnaissance in your environment and then deny them access to your environment needs to shift to more of a disruption, degradation, deception, or contain strategy because of this compressing of these initial stages of the kill chain. What this also means is that you need to be able to respond much faster when there is an activity, a security activity going on in your network, in your environment, than you used to with the previous kill chain. The second key insight from our research really highlights the fact that it doesn't matter your industry any longer, and it doesn't matter your company size. Attackers are really going after anyone with an IP address now. It used to be that maybe if you were in a nonprofit organization or in a small company that you might not think that you were at much risk, but the reality is that it doesn't matter your industry and it doesn't matter your company size. You are at risk now, and you need to make sure that you've got the right capabilities in order to be able to identify attackers and to be able to stop those attackers. Looking at it based on a little bit more detail on specific industries, what this particular chart is showing is the frequency of the different types of attacks by industry. And there's one thing that jumps out immediately, I'm sure to all of you, the bright orange, is the web application attacks. Regardless of industry, that is the primary attack vector that we see. But you can see that the second and third attack vectors do sometimes differ based on industries. So sometimes we see denial of service attacks more in a particular industry, or brute force attacks in another industry. But application attacks, particularly web application attacks, are really the primary attack vector that is regardless of the industry. So as I mentioned, With the use of automation, what we're seeing is, you can think of this almost like robocalling. We all get those phone calls, they want to do surveys and things like that, or around election season. Think of this like robocalling, where what the attackers are doing now is they're using automation tools and they're rolling through IP address ranges. So they'll take an IP address range and they'll run automation at it that includes the reconnaissance, the weaponization, and the delivery and the exploitation all in one single step through automation. And then they'll roll to another IP address range. And what's interesting is that we found in our research that it didn't really matter. We had a hypothesis that we might see more frequency of this in public cloud environments. And the reality is it didn't actually show up statistically in the data when we did the analysis, that regardless of whether you are running in AWS public cloud or another public cloud, or you're running on-prem or a combination in a hybrid environment, this technique of automation is really going after IP addresses regardless of where those environments are actually located. The next thing, this was a bit surprising to us. We saw it initially over this past summer with an attack against a known vulnerability in Oracle's WebLogic application server. And we've seen an increase starting around that time period and through the fall, where what attackers are doing now is they're trying to place crypto miners onto servers because they believe that this is something a bit more like a white-collar crime, right? We're not stealing your customer-sensitive data. We're not stealing social security numbers. We're not stealing credit card information, those sorts of things. All we're doing is we're stealing compute resources in order to be able to do crypto mining and be able to take the profits from that crypto mining and be able to put it into our wallet. And so we're seeing an increase in this type of attack because of this perception that this is somehow less risky, but less of a crime, if you will. But let's be honest, right? This is stealing. This is still theft, and those that are doing this sort of thing should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But there's this perception among many in the hacking community on the bad side that this is somehow less of a crime than stealing data, and so that's why we believe we're seeing the increase in this particular type of attack. And in particular, the Oracle WebLogic attack that I mentioned that took place over the summer, we saw 88% of those particular attacks were specifically cryptojacking attacks. So this is something that definitely you need to be aware of. The other thing that I would mention is, for some of you who've been in the industry for maybe 20, 30 years, you might remember back to the early days of websites. And there were sometimes some people in the IT departments that said, well, there's a bunch of unused capacity here on these servers, so I'm just going to host a couple of websites for myself and maybe some friends and things like that. One thing you need to be aware of here is that same type of behavior is going on as well with crypto miners. So what may look like an attack from the outside actually could be your own staff that's placing crypto miners. So don't just look at this as an external issue, but look at this as both a potential internal issue as well as an external issue. So as I mentioned, application attacks, and you saw the data by industry, application attacks really are the vast majority of the initial attack vectors that we see. And sometimes these will be used in combination with one another as well. So you'll see a web application attack that's also combined with a brute force attack, for example, or a reconnaissance effort. But what this data is showing from left to right is based on the months of the analysis that we did, the frequency of the various different types of attacks, and you can see that web application attacks just continue month over month over month to be the primary attack vector. So what can you do about it? I want to give you some practical guidance here. So I'm going to give you kind of a top 10 list of 10 things that you can do to help prepare your organization better for 2019. The first is knowing what you have. Being able to have a solid understanding of what compute resources you have, where they're running, having asset inventories, having topology maps and relationships and dependency maps is a critical foundational component to protecting yourself. Many organizations have systems that are not well documented, particularly if those are systems that are supporting development and test environments. But if those environments are accessible to the internet, and many of them are, you really need to be thinking about protection across your entire landscape, not just on your production systems, but your development and test systems as well. The second is, it really comes down to what's your appetite for risk, right? I mean, we can't necessarily cover everything all the way. We have limited resources, we have limited budgets, and so having a proper risk analysis and understanding what your risk tolerances are and what systems do you need to have at a high level of protection versus what systems maybe you just need to have at a basic vulnerability scanning level of protection, for example. You might say that for your production systems, I need to have a 24/7 security operations center that's monitoring events and verifying incidents there. For your web applications or for systems that are running critical data that might have customer data in it or credit card data in it, you might want to have an even higher level of protection. But then for your development test systems, you might want to have more of that foundational level where you're just having vulnerability scanning and risk analysis type of capability. So that would be the second thing that I would say is thinking about different risk tolerances and different coverage levels to be able to meet your resource and your budget constraints. The third is, if you don't already have an incident response plan, start writing one on the plane ride home because you don't want to wait until you've been breached to figure out, okay, what do we do now? Now, before you've been breached, is the time to really define an incident response plan. The fourth is good practice of creating a culture of security within the organization. Many of you probably are on DevOps teams or work with DevOps parts of your organizations. There's an extension of the DevOps term referred to as DevSecOps. So this is one way in which you can create a culture of security in your organization, is to get everyone thinking about security all the way back into development. Security isn't something that you should only be thinking about when you're about to put an application into production, but you should be thinking about security from the first line of code that you've written. The fifth is you've got to leverage automation. As I mentioned earlier, based on our research findings, the hackers are using automation more and more, and you need to make sure that that is a tool in your arsenal in order to be able to protect yourself. So the ability to automate log collection, to be able to use machine learning, to be able to support log analysis, those would be good examples of automation. So moving to the second half of the top 10 practical steps here, the sixth one is using the principle of least privilege for your access. Don't over-assign privileges. One of the most popular ways that hackers are able to exploit your systems is by gaining access to user IDs. And if you are over-assigning privileges, that is increasing the risk for your organization. So really think about the least privilege level. What is the minimum level of capability and permissions that I need to give to this particular user or classes of user, rather than giving people higher levels of access that might not necessarily need it. The seventh one, and this is a challenge because there are a tremendous number of vulnerabilities in commercial applications, open source, etc. But actively managing vulnerabilities in your environment, knowing what vulnerabilities do you have? Are those vulnerabilities actually in your images that you're using to be able to deploy new compute workloads? Or are these vulnerabilities that are in previous existing deployed systems? And then having a risk analysis of those vulnerabilities, understanding if that vulnerability gets exploited, what is the risk? So using the example of WebLogic that I mentioned earlier, a vulnerability to a critical application server component could potentially allow access to multiple levels up and down the application stack. So that's something you're going to want to prioritize much higher in terms of patching that type of a vulnerability. But then also understanding what vulnerabilities are actually actively being exploited. So again, the WebLogic example I've used a few times now is a really good example. Our researchers knew about this vulnerability for a year before we saw it actively being exploited. So you have to triage, you have to understand, what your resources can actually handle, and you might choose to not patch certain vulnerabilities because there aren't any active exploits that are occurring against that particular vulnerability, and focusing your time more on the vulnerabilities that have a history, like Apache struts, for example, of active exploits and ongoing exploits. The eighth one is really honing in on compliance and making sure that you have good compliance policies and a good understanding of what level of security controls you need to have in place based on mandates that you might have to adhere to in your particular industry or internal policies. So compliance is actually a critical foundation to having a healthy security program and being able to understand your risk posture and your risk tolerance. Number 9, you want to be able to be actively monitoring. So you want to be able to make sure that this is a 24/7 activity. It's not something that you're going to monitor on a periodic basis, but you have to make this part of your daily operations. And then number 10, kind of a big catch-all here, is really need to think about your entire ecosystem, right? So you need to think about the custom applications that you write, as well as the commercial applications that you purchase. Think about your SaaS applications, think about your on-premise environment, your public cloud environment, and think holistically and understanding what your risk tolerances are and what your risk postures are. So before I close it out, I just wanted to take a little bit more time just to describe a little bit of what Alert Logic is if you're not familiar with Alert Logic. So Alert Logic is a security and compliance solution vendor. We provide a set of security technologies that help you to be able to monitor your environment. We also have a staff of threat researchers that do the kind of research that I've been talking about here today. So we've got PhDs and data scientists that are doing threat research on an ongoing basis. And then we also have a 24/7 security operations center, one located in the US and one located in the UK, so we can have a full follow the sun 24/7 model to support our particular customers. And what we're able to do by bringing all three of those capabilities together, by having the platform, by having the threat intelligence, and the experts, is we're really able to provide a complete set of capabilities to augment your IT teams and to augment your security teams. So a couple of data points here based on what we've analyzed in terms of organizations that were unmonitored or unmanaged, and then the impact of moving over to using Alert Logic services. So we see that the ability to improve the ability to respond with visibility by 40%, the higher risk of not having a monitored environment and being able to reduce that by as much as 2/3 by having a partner like us, to have that 24/7 expertise, so you don't have to have your staff available 24/7, we're doing that for you. And we have a 15-minute SLA. So if we see an issue in your environment, we see that it looks like somebody's trying to exploit your environment, we're going to call you within 15 minutes to let you know what's happening and what steps you can take to remediate yourself against that particular problem. And lastly, I mentioned our threat researchers. We're analyzing petabytes of data every month to understand not only what have we seen, but what trends are occurring. And as examples I shared earlier about, we're seeing the increase in crypto mining. Crypto jacking is a good example of the ability that we can foresee that something might start as small but is growing over time, and we feed that intelligence back into our security operations center so that they're aware of the trends that are taking place in the attacking community. And so this is an example of that, again, just hitting on the Oracle WebLogic example, where our threat intelligence team was aware of the vulnerability, developed the scanning capability to identify that vulnerability in our customers' environments, briefed our security operations center team on this particular vulnerability, but the fact that it wasn't being actively exploited yet. Then when it moved into an active exploit, we were ready. Our customers were ready. We could understand who had that vulnerability, who was actively being exploited, who was not being actively exploited. And so we were able to then reach out to our customers who were being actively exploited to help them remediate as quickly as possible, as well as reach out to all of our other customers to let them know they have this vulnerability, and it's now shifted from being just a known vulnerability to a vulnerability that's now being actively attacked. So the last thing I wanted to close with is let you know that we make this kind of research available publicly. You don't have to be an Alert Logic customer to access this kind of research. So on our website, we have an area referred to as the Critical Watch Center. You can see the URL at the bottom of the slide. You can go out there and you can read the report that this research is based on, as well as other research reports that we continue to do. You can sign up to get emerging threat alerts. So when something like that, vulnerability for WebLogic shifts from just a known vulnerability to active being exploited, that's going to get pushed out via our emerging threat alerts. So you can sign up for those emerging threat alerts, even if you're not an AlertLogic customer. So I would encourage you to go check out the Critical Watch Center and the great resources that we make freely available to the tech community. So with that, I've got maybe 1 or 2 minutes in case there were any questions that anybody wanted to ask.
And I will happily bring you the microphone so that everybody can hear the questions. Hang on one sec.
While she's running over there, the AlertLogic booth is at number 1610. At 1 o'clock, we're actually going to be showing a live hack. So if you'd like to see what it's actually like to see what a hacker does, you can actually go over to our booth, number 1610, at 1 o'clock, and actually watch us do a live hack and how you would respond to that kind of a hack in real time. Your question, sir.
So my question was on your earlier, I think it was your first slide, the list of attack types across the different industries. Were those attack attempts or were those successful breaches?
The data was attack attempts, but also included successful breaches.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Anybody else? Just raise your hand. I'll be happy to come to you.
Great.
All right. I think we're good.
Thank you for your time, and go check out the live hack at 1 o'clock. It's pretty cool.